And then imagine the surprise when this wind and fire fills this room, and then that can't contain them. It spills out into the street where there's all these different nations there. And then all these different nations hear God in their own language. If you was in the form of church that you currently are, whether that meets in a house, whether it meets in a cafe, whether it meets in a church building, whether it meets in a warehouse, wherever it was, and God just told you to wait, but you didn't know at all what was going to happen, you didn't know how long you was going to wait for. And then whatever God pours out, He pours out in such a way that it dismantles your central meeting now and starts to fill tribes all around you. And there's something new out of that forms. When do we get to the place where God can allow our paradigms, our ecclesiology, our format of church, the way that we see things, to be so shifted that it starts to speak the language of a people who have never heard? What would it take for us to... How long would we have to wait before we really broke through in that? Where we really broke through in understanding a new way of bringing the gospel to new people, a new way of seeing the church embedded in new cultures, where it broke out of our patterns, our sign systems, the things that we find comfortable, into something that is completely extraordinary. So these guys are all outside, 12 guys stand up, they preach, and then part of what Peter says in Acts 2:39 to these 3,000 people gathered in the crowd from all different Jews from all different nations is that the promise and sign of what God is doing now is not just for you, it's not just for your household or oikos, it's for the Gentiles and for those who are far off. I just wonder whether in Britain and Europe, for example, and maybe in the West, we're getting from the part of saying the gospel is for you, or discipling is just for you, one-on-one, to that whole thing of, is it not just for the person but for the whole household? So when we meet people, can we imagine a whole household of faith? If we met an imam in the street now, can we imagine it? It's not just for him, but it's for his whole oikos, it's his whole mosque. If we met a person in the street now, from Burton-on-Trent, full of tattoos in one of the real rough pubs there, could we imagine what it would be like if we said to them, we engaged in them in a conversation, we listened to them, we listened to their story, we shared our story, we shared something of what God is doing in the world, and we said, this promise that I'm sharing with you now isn't just for you, it's for everybody that you know in this pub. Now, if that was the case, what form of church would then spring up out of that soil? Would we allow that to happen? Would we provide the opportunity for that to happen? Would we even state up front that that is something that can be and should be expected, that the church would then form out of the soil of those people in that pub? What if you met somebody tomorrow in Costa Coffee, and they met there every Monday morning with a group of business people before they went to work, and you engaged them in some way in conversation, and they basically, their heart was open to God like Lydia's heart was open to God in that time. And what if she then shared it with all of the people around her table or his table? Could church then form around that, and would you know what you would need to do to lay the foundation in order for them to then continue to see church form there? How far are we willing to really break out of our boxes? How far are we really willing to see God really spark a movement in this nation amongst those who are far off? Those people who are close to your culture, you might be able to drag them into your church. If the people who are already similar to yourself, or similar to the culture of your church, you may be able to drag them in. Now, when I say drag, I mean drag them into a Sunday meeting. I mean drag them into your house church. I mean drag them into your simple organic church. Whatever format your church is, if people are already like you, you might be able to get them to add onto your church. But what if they're completely different? And not only they're completely different, but they are leaders within their community. So it's not just them, but actually they carry with them a whole load of other people behind them. What would it look like for you to go there, or to send them back into their culture to see real new forms emerge? So if we moved on from that to looking at Acts 2:42, as a result of these people hearing that this message was not just for them, but for their household, obviously these households then scattered all across the city, because they was told that that's what was expected. This promises for you and your household that results then in churches meeting everywhere, with households all across the city. If we go to Acts 8, we introduce Paul. Notice that Paul's introduction to the church is as a person who is one of the instigators or initiators in the persecution. So from the very beginning, he's a scatterer and he's a movement leader. He helps to scatter the church everywhere. It's interesting what's going on with Syria right now, isn't it? It's interesting that these people are being scattered all over Europe. What is God doing through that? What's God wanting to say to the church right now in relation to that scattering? Are we prepared? Are we ready? And would we know how to not only come alongside people, but share the gospel and see disciples made in such a way that those people that we make disciples of from Syria, spread it along their networks all across Europe and then back into Syria? Or we just say to them, come to our church. You know, how do we see the opportunity that God is giving here? So Acts 8. So Paul was standing there at the time of Stephen's death. And as a result of the death of Stephen, the church was scattered. A great wave of persecution swept over the church. Do we need a great wave of persecution to sweep over us in Europe before we start to scatter disciples into a movement across Europe? You know, I think sometimes God sends ahead prophetic words. He brings people who call out repent in different ways. And then when that doesn't get our attention, sometimes the volume is amplified, shall we say. And persecution is a way of amplifying the volume. Not that God brings persecution, but maybe it gets to a point where that's allowed because that's the very thing that will be heard. And I think actually that we're not that far off in Europe coming to a time when that may be the case. But in the meantime, let's work while it's still day and allow these new forms of church to spring up amongst people wherever they are. Acts 9. Paul is God's chosen instrument to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. There may be people here that God is wanting to choose at this time to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. And by gospel, I don't just mean that you become an evangelist. I mean that you begin to see a call from God to begin to see disciple-making, forms of church, business, new forms of art, etc. that will begin to express itself and connect with those people who are very far off. The Gentiles were those people who were far off. They didn't have the law, they didn't have the covenant, they didn't have an idea of the patterns of God. And I would say that we're in a time now where, as a church, we've become actually quite set in a similar way that the Jews were set at the time when Jesus came, and in their attitude towards reaching the Gentiles. Have we become so solid and set that God has to raise up amongst us people who will now feel a call to go to the Gentiles and those far off, to break out of the patterns and habits that have started to constrain us, and to begin to set ourselves apart from those people who are far off? In other words, do we need to start crossing over out of our kind of Christian cliques, out of our Christian enclaves, wherever that meets in 5 or 10 people, or whether that's a group of 300, to really cross the boundaries over to those who are far off and over to those people who might be considered Gentiles. You know, when Paul and others started to reach the Gentiles, it was pretty offensive, right? What they did was completely opposite to what they were used to doing as Jewish people. Take, for example, the Cornelius story. Let's have a look at that in Acts 10. So Peter is on a roof praying. Cornelius is not a follower of Jesus. He has some background to do with God, but so then does Muslims, so do Jews, so do a lot of other people in the world. But he didn't know about Jesus, the Messiah. But he still receives a message from an angel. Peter, meanwhile, is in his kind of Jewish kind of enclave. They're now believers in Jesus, but they're still very much in that framework, in that culture. And the thing that God communicates to Peter about is these animals that are all the most unclean animals that it says in the Old Testament. These are the animals that you are not to touch. These are the animals that you're not to eat. And they're coming down in a blanket from heaven. And the message is, kill and eat these animals. What might God say to you that would be very offensive, but that would actually reach people who you and your church are not reaching right now? Or would we be willing this weekend to be offended in order to be able to position ourselves to be available to God, to cross a boundary that we're not yet crossing? How offended are we willing to be? When we get to Acts 11, something interesting happens. The people who are scattered through the persecution of Stephen travel as far as Antioch in Syria. And at that point, the people who were scattered were still Jews, and they were still speaking to Jewish people in these places that they were scattered. So they were still going to people who were similar to themselves. And then some people who travelled across from North Africa started to actually speak to people who are not from a Jewish background about Jesus. And loads of people started to come into the kingdom, and they didn't know what to call this movement that was happening. It was the first time that people who were not Jews, or even God-fearers like Cornelius, were coming to faith, and they didn't know what to call it. When was the last time that you got to a place, or we saw a place in mission in this country, where something formed and we actually didn't know what to call the people because it was so different? You know, what would we call those people, as we talked about earlier, who are meeting in the mosque, or meeting in the homeless shelter, who are church? What would we call it? So, in summary, the main point is that are we willing to be broken? Are we willing to really allow our mindsets to shift when it comes to thinking about church? Are we really willing to support and welcome these new forms that are going to emerge whilst preserving the old? And a passage that was reading earlier in Romans 12, it says that we're to offer ourselves as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. And then later on in the passage it says, be transformed into a completely new person by changing the way that you think. Are the ways that we think that are so set that we can't be changed? Or would we put ourselves in a position where we allow ourselves to be changed, where our thought patterns can change to enable us to be the people in this next century, this new dimension, this new mission that God is calling us into? A few thoughts on the last 15 years. That since the turn of the century, people have been experimenting with new forms of church. 2004 was the Fresh Expressions Mission-Shaped Church Report. Around the year 2000 to 2001, many people were writing about organic church, simple church. Around 1998, 1999, house church. Alan Hirsch and others have been talking about the missional church. There's what Mike Green and the guys in Sheffield with 3DM have been doing. There's all kinds of new forms. But the question is, are we going far enough to those who are far away? So there's different ways that we can see these new forms emerge. One is that Christians get a call that it's about moving into something new. So Christians begin to meet in some kind of new form, whether that's in a house, whether that's an organic church, whether that's more a kind of a community that meets in a cafe, in a business. And those people begin to meet differently. The people who are in that community are they then empowered to also then spread the gospel into new communities also of people who are very far from God? And then what would church look like in that kind of setting? And then, so for example, if I was meeting in a cafe with some Christians and one person had a call to reach Muslims, for example, and they went and started to connect with Muslims, have we got to a stage yet where that meeting amongst the Muslims can form into a new form of church? And then if one of the people in there is a leader of the mosque, that they could then see a new form of church in the mosque. And then if somebody in the mosque worked in the Muslim bookshop down the road, would they be able to then see a new form of church in the bookshop down the road? How far are we going in terms of seeing those who are very far off express themselves in new forms of church? And that's something really that we wanted to move beyond the limits to where we are now into something where it's stated from the first time, what do we call this? What do we call these people? Christians. This is something so strange, we've never seen it before.